Hello, this is Bishop Shannon, and I'm happy now to share a story with you about how my heart was opened. It came from the very earliest years of my ministry, in fact, the very first parish that I took as a rector, in the heart of the famous and fabled Mississippi Delta region. It was a congregation of about 80 people that was particularly well known for its outreach programs. Probably most notable, though, was its proximity to the largest maximum security prison in the United States, the Parchman Penitentiary. Shortly after my arrival at that church, we received my first Episcopal visit as a rector. The Right Reverend Duncan Montgomery Gray Jr., someone I had tremendous admiration for, came to visit. And when we got a chance to sit down and talk, he told me that he had plans to start a prison ministry at Parchman, and he wanted me to organize it and lead that. I wasn't particularly happy to hear that news. I didn't think about needing to start up a major outreach program so early in my ministry in that church. And besides, I didn't particularly feel skilled or ready to take on such a ministry. And in fact, I told Bishop Gray that I didn't feel called. I'll never forget his response. He leaned forward and he said, "Well, hear me now, I'm calling you." That was my first lesson in Episcopal authority. And I took on the ministry, the Kairos prison ministry, and it changed my life because it changed the way I thought about myself and the way I understood myself. You may be aware of how the Kairos prison ministry works. It is very much like a Cursillo, but it is in prison. And it is different from a Cursillo because it tries to address the natural leaders in the prison who in fact are the more negative influences. The natural leaders are the block bosses and the gang lords and the drug dealers, and so they were the ones that Kairos reached out to. And the team would go through months of training. There were about 40 of us on the team, and months of training went into planning the visits because we stayed in the prison for 4 days, Thursday through Sunday. I came to know several of the inmates very, very well indeed. There were 2 Kairos weekends per year, and I did 4 years of them before I moved on to another congregation in another part of Mississippi. But those 4 years, as I mentioned, were some of the most important in my life. I learned that I had gifts that I did not know, that were called out of me by other people on the Kairos team, and indeed very much so by people who were inmates in Parchman Prison. I came to know many people in the earliest parts of their own Christian journey, and so it was very much like being in the book of Acts. All you had was your story, your witness, your ministry. You didn't have any authority. This counted for nothing there. And we were charged with just telling our stories and walking with the inmates so that they might learn something of their own sense of call into Christianity and a life of discipleship and faith, even in the prison. When it was time to leave, there was a party given for me, and I was made an honorary inmate and given a stole, a green and white striped stole that was made out of the cloth that the inmates had to use for their uniforms. It's very precious to me because it means so much. Many of the inmates were people that I felt had a tremendous heart for the faith, and they proved that time and time again. I never forgot the lesson that I'm not always the best judge of what my gifts might be. Bishop Gray did indeed call me. He called me out of the way I understood myself at the time and into my truer self. The inmates, in fact, called me into community, and I grew in that community. I grew as a disciple because of that ministry. My point is that we are very often at a loss to understand the fullness of our gifts because we are kind of mired in a way that we understand our gifts according to the way our lives are lived right now. If everything has to stay the way it is right now, of course we will never move into something new or something that changes. And that is not what Christian discipleship intends. Jesus came to make a difference in personal life, in relationship with God and one another. And Jesus came to establish a church that would make a difference in the world. There is very much an expectation that we will change, that we will move into something that will call us into the dawning of God's kingdom, something radically new. So I want to charge you with the idea that you can discover your gifts by opening yourself to those around you, in your congregations, in your families, in your workplace. It's extremely important to understand how God works in your life, though. Think about how God moves when you have a sense of God being especially present to you in your life. For me, I've learned through my spiritual director that God works with me mostly in the unlikely, such as the call into prison ministry. The unlikely, a call into unlikely settings, calls that happen in an unusual way, calls that are something that are very different from what I have come to understand or what I would prefer. Whenever I get a call that is unlikely, then my spiritual director has asked me to pay particular attention to what is going on. I can certainly number the phone call I received to participate in the search to be Bishop Coadjutor of the Diocese of Virginia was extremely unlikely, but because I'd learned by that time to pay attention to how the Holy Spirit moved in my life in the unlikely, I was willing and able to participate in that search and be elected. I share this story with you so that you might be encouraged to share your own story with others. Back in the prison ministry, how God moved in life was something that the inmates were very interested in. So I had to learn how to tell my story about how God moved in my life. And that was something that was a work in progress. It always is. We don't have to wait until we have it. It's something that is always changing and it's very dynamic. But we do have something to share. So as I've told you something of my story here, I invite you to be able to think about and learn how to share your story with your family, your co-workers, with your friends, in a way that is able to call them into understanding their own story. This is how congregations work together. This is how communities empower one another. Not only do communities empower one another, we also are sharing the story of Jesus Christ Himself, God among us, God with us. So never underestimate your being able to share your story in a way that has power you might not know beforehand, you might not even understand, but the power of the Holy Spirit is there in being able to share stories, because I will never forget that I was called into something that I would never have chosen myself. I'll never forget that my heart was opened by a call. That's the way God works, and it's part of the wonder of God. It's part of the wonder of the gospel, that we are called into new life. Jesus called it abundant life, life more richer than we could ever ask or imagine, as the prayer says. When we share our stories, we share Jesus Christ, and when we share Jesus Christ, we heal the world. That healing begins with your story. And if I may now channel my inner Bishop Gray, hear me now, I'm calling you.